Now we're going to move forward with our first plenary, and something that Steve said really jumped out at me, which was the idea that they put their jump bike first in their affordable housing communities. And we made a very conscious decision to put this topic, the social justice and equitable adaptation plenary, first for you, because it is a first topic that we all need to be putting forward ahead of other things in many of the work and areas we do. So I'm very honored to host this topic today and introduce our moderator, Yana Garcia. Come on up. And if our speakers want to come on up and get comfortable as well, that would be great. Yana Garcia is Assistant Secretary for Environmental Justice and Tribal Affairs in the California Environmental Protection Agency. Assistant Secretary Garcia was appointed by Governor Brown in June of 2017 to serve for Environmental Justice and Tribal Affairs at the California Environmental Protection Agency. You guys can come on, go ahead. We're cozy here. Prior to joining Cal EPA, Yana was an associate attorney at Earth Justice in the California Regional Office in San Francisco. She was also a staff attorney at Communities for a Better Environment, serving in Huntington Park and Oakland. Her legal practice areas have focused on environmental justice issues, civil rights, land use, toxics and chemical disclosure, oil and gas extraction, and crude transport. Prior to practicing law, Yana worked on various environmental justice and civil rights projects aimed at achieving equitable access to clean air, clean water, and sustainable food and energy systems in the states of Texas, New Mexico, and Massachusetts. So thank you very much, and I'll turn it over to you.
Morning. I'm going to take advantage of the podium for a few minutes because I love podiums and I miss them. Good morning. I'm really excited to welcome you all here this morning and really thank the Local Government Commission for making this priority this morning for the framing for the rest of the program that lies ahead. Some of you may have been able to catch some of yesterday's kickoff workshops, which did deal with tribal issues as well as environmental justice and equity issues. This morning, we really want to provide some early thoughts, early framing, and most importantly, to get you sort of motivated and energized to take on the hard work that lies ahead, not just when it comes to adaptation, resilience, and really building the clean, green economy of our future, but also bringing all of us along. I think that's really the theme for the rest of the days ahead. I am the Assistant Secretary for Environmental Justice and Tribal Affairs at Cal EPA. It is my work to work with our boards and departments to really incorporate environmental justice, equity, principles around social justice and racial equity in particular into the very fabric of what we do. Now, as I'm sure you could imagine, that is difficult on a day-to-day basis. My work involves a lot of digging for and finding opportunities to bring in and uplift the voices of those who are all too often disenfranchised, who are left out of decision-making processes that affect their day-to-day lives. And it's work that is very heartfelt for me. I am from Oakland, California. My family is originally from Los Angeles, from East LA and South Central Los Angeles, two areas where the effects of climate change are certainly felt. And the effects of a lot of movement of people is also felt. Both areas have experienced a good amount of gentrification and displacement in the recent years, displacement of long-standing historical residents, primarily low-income communities and communities of color. So for me, this work is very much a part of the very fabric of my being. And I feel very grateful to be here this morning. I feel even more grateful and honored to be able to introduce such wonderful guests. Is Ms. DuPont going to be joining us via video? I'm going to start with Jackie DuPont Walker. She is the founding president of the Ward Economic Development Corporation, an organization that's focused much of its efforts on increasing low-income housing across the city of LA. She's known for her tireless energy, firm allegiance, and integrity in the trenches. Jackie has served in many trailblazing roles, including the desegregation of Florida State University. She's been a pioneer in the world of banking, defining community needs as a member of Bank of America's Social Policy Board, among other banking and investment-based organizations. She was appointed recently by Mayor Eric Garcia to serve on the LA County Metro Board as the board's only non-elected official member. Governor Brown likewise appointed her to the Baldwin Hills Conservancy, where she continues to serve. She's a lifelong member of the African Methodist Episcopal Church and continues to be an active member of the Ward Parish in Los Angeles. She selflessly devotes her skills and resources and commits her passion to facilitating economic and social empowerment, mentoring new leadership, advocating for cutting-edge solutions, and encouraging institutional change to enhance the quality of life for all people. Christina Snyder, who I'm lucky to call a colleague, was appointed by Governor Brown to serve as the governor's tribal advisor and executive secretary to the Native American Heritage Commission. She specifically works to assist the administration in improving the state's communication and collaboration with California Native American tribes. She earned her Juris Doctorate degree from the University of California, Los Angeles School of Law. She served as an Indian Child Welfare Act representative for her tribe, the Dry Creek Rancheria Band of Pomo Indians, since 2017. She's also served as counsel in private practice, as a staff attorney at the National Congress of American Indians, a legal fellow at the Wish-Doyo Foundation, and a law clerk at the Office of Tribal Justice at the U.S. Department of Justice. Ms. Snyder is also a member of the Dry Creek Rancheria Housing Advisory Committee and the California Indian Law Association. Orson, a friend and colleague, is president of the Greenlining Institute, one of the nation's largest and most successful multi-ethnic advocacy leadership development nonprofits. Greenlining envisions a nation where race is never a barrier to economic opportunity and where communities of color thrive. Now, because people of color will be the majority of our nation's population by 2040, Greenlining believes deeply that America will prosper only if communities of color prosper. Now, under Orson's leadership, Greenlining has become a leading voice in the movement to fight redlining by advocating for greenlining policies, particularly in the areas of economy, the environment, health, energy, voting, and telecommunications. Please join me in welcoming these panelists. And I'd like to kick it off by having each of our panelists describe a little bit about how they personally and their organization are involved in promoting social justice and racial equity in climate and adaptation programs. How do you build an equity lens into the work you're doing locally, statewide, and why is it important to examine social and racial equity in the work that we do? And I think we'll start with Ms. DuPont Walker.
Good morning, and thank you, Yana. Greetings to the participants of the third biennial conference Adaptation Forum. I very much regret not being able to be there, but yesterday, on advice of my husband's doctor, we went to urgent care, which I now understand is for very minor issues, only to be ushered to Cedars-Sinai emergency room where he is today. I worry sometimes that 1984 and Brave New World had arrived and we'll all be in our cubicles, but today I am very happy for the opportunity to transmit to you from my cubicle here in Los Angeles, to those of you in Sacramento. Thank you, Yana, and to members of the panel. I'm sorry I'm not there today, and to all the new friends I thought I would meet. I hope next year at the next conference I will be able to be present. Today I thank you for the opportunity to share some of my thoughts and hope that they tie into the questions that Yana will ask later and respondents of my panelists. I borrowed today from something that was triggered by yesterday's minor crisis with my husband, and something that has become a password through Equal America. People preserve what they love. People preserve what they love. As I think about that, it's probably the story of each one of our lives. If we think back on what we have done, what we are doing, and what we believe is important in the future, it is about what we love. A little bit of my story, and as I tell mine, think about yours. I was born into a family of very independent men and women thinkers. My maternal grandfather was the only person of African descent who could own a business in downtown Tallahassee, Florida. If you know Tallahassee, it's North Florida. Some people call it South Georgia and Southeast Alabama. He had to find a way to serve the population, to ply his trade of making shoes, and still serve his fellow African Americans, clerk we will call them, who had to come to a back door. My mother grew up in an atmosphere of that kind of trailblazing and married a man who ended up being one of the leaders of the Tallahassee bus boycott that was simultaneous to the Montgomery bus boycott, and actually was the first person of African descent to run for office in that section of Florida where lynching was still alive. And although he did not win in the 1950s, it was some 25 years later that he saw the fruits of his labor. And then my parents decided that I would go on to desegregate Florida State University. Now that was a trip. I didn't consider myself a civil rights advocate, but I was there at the time that we had many of the crises in civil rights movement. And so what I love and have been called to, and God uniquely placed me in the village of, is social justice. But it took a young lady, Cara, from Equal America, who bugged me for a year or more to understand the connection between social justice and the urgency of climate change. She was patient. She listened to my excuses. She took every opportunity for me and connected to what she was calling me about. Until finally I had no choice but to calm my spirit and understand that climate change was personal. She made it personal in the way that she approached me and understood the connection, helped me understand the linkage. It's also important to become literate in climate change. After I caught the vision through Equal America, we were talking about in our church context as we prepare to make this one of our international initiatives. And sometimes here in the United States, we think that we are the most progressive. As we talked about what we needed to do in the context of our church and how we needed to have litanies and bulletin announcements and flyers, one of our leaders from Zimbabwe very calmly said, "Would you like to see the Sunday school lessons we had drafted?" They had, because of the urgency they felt and the connectedness to their faith walk, already crafted Sunday school lessons for their young people. So while we're talking about adapting our adult literature for them, they had already moved ahead. They had become climate literate, and their young people were doing that. It was a blessing. It's also important for us in the work I do in the African Methodist Episcopal Church as the social action officer to translate the spiritual urgency to political power. It's never been an issue for the AME Church that we would be involved in advocacy and dealing with issues of the community, everything that impacts every human being, not just those of African descent. But in today's world, we have to translate that in a time that sometimes we believe the spiritual walk is in isolation. It's about the personal improvement and only about the biblical lessons. Biblical lessons guide us, but it's so important to make that a lesson for today, that people who may never see the inside of the walls of the church will understand the spiritual power is related to the political power. More important than anything else, I think, in the lesson today is that partners are important. Sometimes in the things that we love, we make them silos, and we want people to come to our silos, and we want to spread wisdom and joy and tools from our silos. But partners are important. And so the partnership today, bringing people from all walks of life together, is extremely important. But there are also some immediate partnerships coming up if we look at our calendars. The AME Church has declared September 2nd is Social Justice Sunday. And on that day, as we talk about social justice, we will lift up the issues of climate change. On September 6th, the AME Church is calling all people of goodwill to come to Washington, D.C., to Lafayette Plaza, to confront an administration that has declined to deal with integrity and social justice. And we're calling it a call to conscious and forward to action. I believe that those from Credo who are planning the Face the Climate on September 8th need to be among the crowd on September 6th, and September 6th needs to come back and be among the crowd on September 8th. It's about our future. We all know that climate matters. And so we have models historically in Noah, in the Bible, and Esther, who understood that it mattered what happens to people. whether it's Malcolm or Martin or Rosa Parks in the civil rights days, or Diane Nash, who went into the education institutions and taught young people how to stand and be advocates, or more recently, Heather Heyer, who in living out her conviction made the ultimate sacrifice. It does not matter where we are and from what perch or brand or ID we have a way and must be called to connect the dots. There was a civil rights leader, Andrew Young, who also was a faith leader, a public servant, and entrepreneur. And I think he puts it all into focus in a statement that I borrowed from a litany that we'll be using on Social Justice Sunday. Andrew Young said, "The complexity of good and evil in this world is going to always be with us. It is a reason social justice is an ongoing battle for good. It includes clean water, clean air, nutritious food, and then the connectors, equal access to health care and education, equal protection under the law, fair and humane immigration policies, stands against racism, sexism, religious bigotry, police brutality, white supremacy, apathy, voter suppression, and continue to add. My sisters and brothers, today we are reminded it is our watch. While we remember the victories of yesterday and anticipate what we will leave as legacy tomorrow, it is what we do today that counts. It is our watch. It is our calling to fulfill. So today, I challenge you to move from our silos, find ways to connect. Remember that as we greet each other in understanding and hearing what each one of us loves, we can help commit as a team in unity to that which we preserve. For me, it is social justice, and it clearly includes climate change. And so I look forward to seeing you around as we connect to make sure that on our watch, there'll be something significant that can be said about our faithfulness to this initiative. Thank you, and I appreciate this opportunity.
Thank you to Jackie. So why don't we start with Orson, actually, talking a little bit about how your particular organization really incorporates and promotes social justice and racial equity and why that's important in your work.
Sure. Thank you very much, Yana. And first, just really want to appreciate this forum and the comments we heard earlier from Kate and Steve, rooted in racial equity. It's, that's kind of what we do. I get here because, for me, it's a personal passion. I was born and raised in East LA in the neighborhood of Boyle Heights. And so I grew up near freeways, near boulevards with semis, with incinerators nearby, seeing the mothers of East LA march against prisons and incinerators and all the bad stuff that was being located. And so when I came to this work over 20 years ago, I came to it from a mindset of fighting poverty and pollution. 20 years ago, not that many people, especially in East LA, were talking about climate change. And so poverty and pollution were the things that I wanted to fight when I started this journey at Greenlighting. Fast forward today, I've been the president of the Greenlighting Institute for nearly a decade now. And what Greenlighting does, it's very simple. We exist because of this thing called redlining. And redlining is, you can envision this map, and every city had it. If you look up, if you Google redlining Sacramento, redlining Fresno, redlining Oakland, you'll see this map with these red areas. This was a government-sanctioned map, and it basically outlined how we would grow in these areas. So it was definitely not smart growth, it was dumb growth and racist growth, because it said in the red areas, this is where the undesirable, this is where the people of color will live. And you can't give loans in this area, you can't provide investments in this area. And if you want to put a polluting facility, this is the best place to put it. And so fast forward, this was the 1920s, 100 years later, we're wondering why we see the things we see. is because of issues of redlining. And so how do you combat that? And so first of all, for us, since redlining was race-specific, it was a race-specific policy, we have to put race at the forefront. We have to ensure that there's equity in mind and that we're directing resources to those redlined areas. Secondly, it's about community involvement and really allowing communities to determine what they want in their communities. And so now, we're seeing these redline areas suddenly are hot areas, right? They're ripe for gentrification. I live in an area that's, you could say, is gentrifying in East Oakland or where I'm from in Boyle Heights. And people say, well, isn't that the investment you wanted? And my quick answer is no, because we wanted to empower the folks in the community to build the communities for themselves. And this is investment that's coming in without their knowledge, without them having a seat at the table. And so we're basically about those two things, is directing resources to areas, underrepresented areas, areas that have been redlined, but most importantly, just making sure that the communities in those areas are empowered, are informed, and have the capacity to drive their destiny so that they can be more resilient, more adaptive, and most importantly, they can thrive. And the last thing I'll say is, I did my part this morning to adapt. I wore my guayabera. I usually wear a suit when I speak. I was like, it's Sacramento summer, maybe we should ditch the suit. It's getting too hot. And so if anybody wants to make that proposal in Sacramento, I'd love to ditch the suit and just wear a guayabera every day. Thank you.
Personal adaptation. Thank you. And Christina, I think, at least in my work as both, Assistant Secretary for Environmental Justice and Tribal Affairs, I see a lot of distinction between the approach that we take with tribal communities and that we should really take given the history that the state has and that the federal government has with tribal communities. So how do you see social justice, racial justice, and equity issues permeating the work that you do specifically with tribes?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. And I also apologize, you're not getting my best face today. I just got in from Yolo County last night. Around 1 a.m. I was meeting with tribes out there at Owens Lake. There's a dry lake bed that I'll probably talk about a little bit within this context because it has a lot to do with climate action and climate change and some of the issues that tribes face by being, you spoke a little bit about redlining. Here we're talking about tribes are bound to their land both culturally, spiritually, and they're reservation based. So we're talking about cultures that are both, they have a lot of meaning in the land that they're from, but they're also dependent on economies that are inherently land-based. So when we talk about climate change and we talk about things like, changing vegetation and drought and and redirecting rivers, we're really talking about taking away resources from people who can't do anything about it and can't really just pick up and leave. And frankly, don't want to pick up and leave because they've been living here since time immemorial and depending on the lands that they live in for both their spiritual practices, but also for sustenance and other economies. First, I guess I'll just explain my office a little bit for those of you who don't who don't know about it. Everyone has varying levels of familiarity with Native American policy and background, and so I'll try to start from the ground up, but sometimes I am bad at explaining kind of the basic principles. So if you think that Yana is really good at this work too, so you can plug in where I'm kind of doing you know what, I'll just go right in.
Go for it.
So I'm both the tribal advisor for the governor, which means that really it's a kind of new role that was created under Executive Order B-1011 under Governor Brown, and it calls for consultation policies throughout the agencies and the administration on a government-to-government basis with California Indian tribes. But it also creates this role of the tribal advisor that advises the work of the governor. And so as the tribal advisor, you can kind of make that as big or as small as you want. I've chosen to not get any sleep and drive down to Owens Valley and back in a day and within the past 2 weeks have been pretty much all the way down to San Diego and all the way up to almost the Oregon border, and then over to in Nevada yesterday. So I think really the role of the tribal advisor, as I see it, is to go bear witness to what's happening in Indian lands and communicate that back to both the governor, the governor's office, and then also the broader administration, because a lot of these peoples don't have the time or the resources or the bandwidth to come up to Sacramento to advocate for their own interests. And so while I'm not a tribal advocate, I am communicating my experience to the broader administration so that they can better understand what's going on outside of Sacramento. A lot of that consists of going up to the Klamath River and seeing what's going on with algae growth and problems with flows and fish health up there, which for tribes, that's both a source of sustenance, but also it's a life way that they've been practicing for millennia. And so being in those spaces, going down to Owens Lake and seeing what used to be this giant lake, it's just a dry lake bed now. And seeing that these sacred springs are just not there anymore, and there's no source of sustenance or water, or which we all know is life, for these peoples who have lived there since time immemorial. It's just, it really informs the work of the administration and makes it really real, because that's every day for them. So really, that's how I see my role as the tribal advisor. My path in this climate, or my role in this climate area, is to inform the work in a way that that adequately represents those interests. So tribes are not just ethnicities, they're not just races, they're governmental units and they're cultural units, and they are inherently land-based. And so being able to inform the administration of things like, you know, when you divert water and create dry lake beds, you're also creating some of the worst air quality in the state in a place like Mammoth, where it's just, you wouldn't expect that because there's no cars there or anything like that. I'll wrap it up in a second. But so that's kind of what it is elevating those issues in a way so that people can understand when they have no context for, you know, most people, if they don't have resources or they don't have jobs, they can just pick up and move, and they can just, you know, move to LA, move to San Francisco. But tribes can't do that, and they don't want to do that. So just communicating those issues to the administration is important. In my role as executive secretary of the Native American Heritage Commission, because I have two jobs, that commission is tasked with protecting cultural resources under California state law. So we enforce certain provisions of CEQA that allow for higher tribal engagement when there's cultural resources involved. And we also have been tasked with enforcing the California Native American Graves and Protection and Repatriation Act, which those issues are implicated more and more as we see the effects of climate change, whether it's, you know, again, drying lake beds that are implicating cultural resources that are being exposed or now need to be protected, you know, or, you know, when we're talking about dam removal and things like that, we're talking about these cultural resources that now we need to at least have tribal engagement and have them at the table in figuring out how we're going to account for that. So I guess that's my roundabout way of getting to this work, and really what has motivated me to enter into this work is, as Yana mentioned, I'm a member of the Dry Creek Grand Tree Band of Pomo Indians, and I, as a California Indian, we're largely invisible. I don't think that if you saw a California Native person, it would immediately occur to you that they were a California Native person, because we're so not in the public eye, and most representations of Native people are more Southwest or Plains Indians. We don't have teepees here, sorry to disappoint. But so part of my motivation is just to make sure that these issues are visible and elevated, and that's kind of why I have been drawn to this work.
I think in both the environmental justice space and in the space of tribal affairs, there have been a lot of recent efforts. You mentioned Executive Order B1011, which really instituted a new requirement, a new direction to consult with California tribes, regardless of federal recognition status, which was a really big step that this administration took. And I think has given us all the opportunity to really take a look at how we engage with tribes statewide. And in that process, really flesh out what do things like consultation mean? How is that different than, public input, public comment? And in many ways, the past 10 years have also been really telling in terms of how we consult with environmental justice stakeholders as well. I think really important to keep the two distinct, but also to see some of the common threads in terms of really reaching out to those who have been intentionally excluded from decision making. And so now I'm curious to kick it back to you two to think a little bit about and talk to us about some of the best practices that have emerged. Are there examples of situations where a given land use decision or regulatory development or housing proposal or development proposal has really shown us how we can bring community voices in, or how we can bring in tribal voices to think about and envision what that development might look like, or what that future might look like? What are the sort of best practices that are out there, if there are any, and if there are not? Let's talk a little bit about that. Orson, you want to start?
Sure. So when you think about adaptation, resilience, there's been a lot of focus on infrastructure, and rightly so, and we would say from greenlining standpoint, there hasn't been that much focus on people and making communities resilient and engaging those communities. And so specifically, if you look at a kind of a narrow view of adaptation resiliency, I would say you don't see much. But if you look at a larger scale of what other projects that are happening, that they might not be talking about climate change, but what they're practicing is really what we need. And so one example is I'm on the board of the Unity Council, a social equity nonprofit corporation in Oakland. Right now they're building 100 units of affordable housing right near the BART station. And there was a lot of pushback because BART and others said, this should be mixed housing. Some said it should be market rate housing. Because there's already, there's not enough market rate housing in Oakland. But if you look at what's happening in East Oakland, is all the housing that was naturally affordable housing before is not affordable anymore. And so why not build 100% affordable housing? And so they have two projects. It's going to be all 100% affordable housing. They are using greenhouse gas reduction dollars. But I'm on the board of this organization, we never talk about adaptation and resiliency. But what we're doing is like the best example, right? We're keeping people in cities, we're making sure it's affordable, and we're layering it with services. So we're putting organizations, nonprofits that are going to be tenants on the ground floor that do restorative justice, work with indigenous communities. And so to me, like those examples are happening everywhere. There's not enough. And one of the things that we talk about is, and we heard earlier, is housing has to be at the forefront of this. Like everybody in this room should be advocating for affordable housing or housing of some type. And we know housing could be sticky, messy, but I always say there's 2 points. Is we always need more money for affordable housing. Like that's an easy one, we can all agree to that. And 2 is every city should do its fair share of building affordable housing. It's not fair that the affordable housing burdens always fall on cities like Oakland and LA. Every city where there are low-wage workers, and that's every city, should be building affordable housing.
Thank you. And in the tribal sphere, one thing I do just want to point out as well is that I think there are often, particularly when it comes to cultural resources and the consultation that comes with cultural resources, we think of the need to consult with tribes often if we have, a facility expansion project, something dirty, potentially, some, polluting facility that needs to take in more and expand its operations. And oftentimes, of course, those are cited around tribal lands, but there are also a lot of forward-looking positive projects that should likewise require us to consult. And whether that's around the potential for cultural resources impacts in the surrounding area, or whether it's really around bringing tribes in to leverage things like traditional ecological knowledge to really leverage the stewardship that tribes have shown for time immemorial, that's still an area that we're exploring. And so from the tribal perspective, what do you think are some best practices, whether it's on the side of, facility expansion projects or the more sort of forward-looking positive side of adaptation and resilience work?
Well, I'll talk about two projects that I can think of off the top of my head. One of them is that the Energy Commission did this desert wind project out in the desert. And part of that required them to consult with tribes and do a lot of cultural resource mapping. But if you're familiar with this work, cultural resources and sacred sites are very confidential, they're very special to tribes, and it's something that we need to be really careful about when we are working with them from a state perspective, because they're not our resources, they're not our sites, and when we do these projects, we need to be mindful that they're there and that we need to protect them, or we need to avoid them if possible. But we also need to guard their confidentiality really highly. In the instances when that's gotten out, it's been awful. What happens is you have people that just like to go to these sites and, maybe bring their crystals out and have, a yoga session. Or conversely, you have people who, they trade in these cultural resources. And so it can be really destructive. And it's almost all tribes have left at this point in terms of our past and our ancestors. And so with that project, I've heard from the state side, so I'll just say it from the state side, and then maybe I'll get a different story when I go down to the desert. But what they did was they had this cultural resource mapping, database that was able to tell people not really where and what the cultural resources were, but tribes were able to plug in information about general geographic locations that they should be avoiding when they approach this project. And this was done as the result of confidential consultation and a lot of trust that was built between the Energy Commission and the tribes, and it ended up resulting in a successful project in the desert, from what I've heard so far from the state end, where tribes didn't have to divulge that confidential information, but the Energy Commission could be respectful of that. And you don't always have that in these energy projects. You want to think that tribal interests and climate adaptation go hand in hand, but a lot of times when you're talking about people's ancestors, the site that you've picked is it's a hotbed, and you need to be really careful of that. For example, you even have right now, there's projects going on offshore wind energy. And so those considerations need to be taken into account, where tribes, their cultural practices and their religions and things like that are, because they're land-based and they're ocean-based, that view obstruction can even be an impact to their cultural rights. And so I think the Desert Wind Project is an example of good, mutual, respectful collaboration. Another climate adaptation type of thing that incorporates traditional ecological knowledge is up north in Six Rivers. The Karuk tribe has actually partnered with the local fire departments to do kind of a pilot project where they do cultural burns in certain areas. And what they do is the Karuk Fire Department partners with the local fire department, and they'll take little swaths of land and they'll just basically burn down the undergrowth like they did prior to, there was the Spanish order not to do burns, basically. And so this is something that they've done forever to maintain forest health, and it actually, the acorns in the area become stronger, all of the herbs in the area become stronger, all of the medicines that they traditionally collect become stronger because all of the invasive, non-native California plants, they aren't adapted to these naturally occurring fires. And so up there, there's been this really respectful engagement of, between the local fire department, between the tribe, so that both are benefiting, because this is also, as many of you know, this is also prescriptive burning, which prevents some of these catastrophic fires like we're seeing right now. So when you see really respectful engagement, I think everybody benefits. And just acknowledging that tribes have been doing something for a long time and treating that as valuable knowledge rather than something that's like, oh, well, science has now validated the thing that you've been doing for thousands of years. I think that's kind of the first step to respectful engagement.
And a quick follow-up, do you see there being, you mentioned water is life, which I think is the sort of tagline that many of us are now familiar with that was really uplifted in the Standing Rock work. Do you see there being an opportunity here, sort of some movement to really look at some of what, indigenous and tribal people have been doing forever?
I would hope so. Water is only going to become more of a valuable resource, especially here. And I think that a lot of tribes have been hurt just through neglect and just being kept out of sight and out of mind. A lot of tribes, their resources have been completely diverted for decades to meet the needs of other populations. And nobody really goes and sees that and sees kind of how devastating the impacts are. And so, what I saw yesterday, for example, is that there's a lot of different pilot projects that tribes are actually taking the lead on, of like, let's unplug this spring that's naturally occurring and see what happens. Mm-hmm. And it actually has been pretty effective in mitigating problematic dust and all of that. And so particulates in the air are down when you actually just let the land do what it's supposed to do. But so I think that, we're seeing that the more that people listen to tribes, millennia old knowledge of how to manage this land in a sustainable way, the more it actually makes sense. So I would hope that that becomes something that people rely on more.
Okay. And Orson, greenlining obviously does work throughout the state. And I know when I travel from, Bakersfield to South Stockton, or from Brawley to northern Mendocino County, there are huge differences. There are many common threads, but there are also really big differences in terms of what the needs are of whatever given specific community is working towards something. How does greenlining deal with, the difference between looking at issues around racial and social justice and equity in an urban setting versus rural settings, and what does that look like across the state?
Yeah, that's a great question. Background, Greenlining is a statewide organization. Our office is in Oakland with about 50 employees, and then we have one person in San Diego. And I want the San Diego job so I can surf with them every day. But the way we've worked, we have a long history of working with Jackie DuPont Walker on economic development issues. And so it starts with engaging folks at the local level who really know, they know their community. And so whether it's the work that we've done in Stockton recently to help the city apply to a transformative climate communities planning grant, whether it's work that we're going to be doing in East Palo Alto, whether it's the work we did in Huron to help the mayor, Ray Leon there, bring the Green Raiteros program, where he brought an electric vehicle ride-sharing program to this really small rural city called Huron in the Central Valley. And so it always starts with engaging the locals, the locals know best, and really empowering them to speak for their communities. Like I always say, I work for them. I'm a technical assistance provider, I'm an advocate. Whatever the locals want, then we try to figure that out, right? Whether it's something as simple as money or a network, a connection, excuse me, to a bank so that they can tap their Community Reinvestment Act dollars, or whether it's a connection to a utility because we've been doing work around utilities for a long time, or whether it's another financial service industry. And so the beauty of what we've been doing at Greenlining is that we've been working on all these different threads that allow communities to be more resilient, right? A lot of communities don't have access to broadband and high-speed internet, which is scary because, the news that they're gonna need is gonna be through the internet, right? Very few people have the old copper line anymore. And we know that cell phone service is very expensive for a lot of low-wage workers. And so we always say it's engage the locals, empower the locals, and do what they want. Don't come in with an agenda, come in, listen, and really empower the folks there, whether it's the Jackie DuPont Walkers or the Ray Leones or the other community-based leaders. It always starts with them, and that's one of the things that we always have done, and one of the things that we always preach.
And a quick follow-up, because you mentioned ride sharing, of course, and I wonder what you think and what you'd have to say to folks at the local government level in dealing with the apparent takeover of ride sharing apps and what that causes from a land use planning perspective. Do you have any thoughts on ride sharing from sort of Greenlining's perspective and from an equity-based perspective?
Yeah, no, definitely ride sharing needs to be regulated, right? If it is going to be a mode of transportation, it should be regulated. There's many ways that we could regulate it. One way definitely that we agree with is ensuring that the workers, the drivers, Uber, we'll call them partners, making sure that they're actually getting paid a living wage. It starts with that. But really regulating and making sure that they're working with our transit agencies. I think that the transportation companies, the TNCs, I think they're here to stay. We just need to make sure that they're working in collaboration with transit, with bike sharing, with all these other programs, and that they're not competing against it, that they're not undermining it. And the only way we're going to get there is through conversation, but it's going to be really through regulation. Mm-hmm. And so we need to have more of those conversations, because I think right now it is kind of a place where they want to compete, right? You even will get something that says, why take the bus where you can take Lyft and Uber? There has to be a way that this is part of a comprehensive transportation system that serves everybody, not just tech workers, but also low-wage workers who might not be near a bus line or a train line and need that last mile or that last 2 miles. TNC could be the solution for that.
And so I think we've made, a good amount of progress. I think we have a long way to go until we see, fully just and equitable land use development policies and projects statewide, and till we really feel like everyone's at the table with an equal voice. And so I'll start with you, Christina, but I'm curious to hear from both of you. What are our blind spots? What do you think we're just totally missing? Who's glaringly absent from the table still, and what is that sort of glaring omission in your view?
Well, tribes are absent from the table, and right. I think a lot of this is at both the state and federal level, is that it's just kind of that neglect thing. Is it doesn't occur to anybody that tribes should be able to access a lot of the programs that are passed under statute. And so what happens is that we end up we're administering programs at the agency level that don't actually allow for tribes to access funds or to be able to get seed money to leverage funds to be able to do projects on reservation that could benefit the local community. Part of it is that a lot of times legislators have really no concept of how tribes actually function within the broader jurisdictional scheme. And so what happens is you'll have legislation that authorizes, funding for projects to states, agencies, local communities, and nonprofits, and tribes aren't any of those things. And they don't want to be classified as any of those things because this is just a little Indian Law 101, but tribes have a different status from local communities and states. And so most of the time they don't want to be classified like that because they think it's an infringement on their inherent sovereignty. And so it's more about, a lot of times, just, doing a quick fix just for parity and adding and tribes so that tribes can access some of these funding sources. So, for example, you have programs that allow for development of renewables and for microgrids. And tribes can't access those funds unless they decide to classify themselves as a local government. Another hurdle that you have there is that, let's say that a tribe does want to do this and they can't access those funds. There's not the infrastructure to be able to sell that renewable energy off reservation at this time. And so they can't really get private funding either because it doesn't make financial sense for them. So in order for them to be able to engage in some of these more sophisticated, aggressive climate action projects, they really need to be in a good place to self-fund or tack it on to another project. And so really I think that it's a matter of infrastructure, but also legislative framework. And a lot of that is, there's broader issues with that don't just apply to this work. And so I think it's really, legislators just need to educate themselves.
Yeah. I think so. And in the meantime, really stretching ourselves to think about what opportunities are there. So especially in the realm of funding, and particularly in this political climate where so many tribes are dealing with far less funding than they've had in the past federally, really thinking about how we can complement some of the small funds they may have with, even if they're small grants. We, out of the Environmental Justice Unit at Cal EPA, we run a small grants program and that is open to tribes. So these are small $50,000 grants, but they make a really big difference when it comes to really providing that cushion in light of a loss of funding on the federal level. But I totally agree on with the answer being legislation, I think, in many ways. Orson, what are your thoughts? Who do you think we're missing? What's the sort of glaring omission that you see?
Big omission is community outreach. Outreach and engagement of communities. I was looking at the map, the red map that you showed, Kate, right? And we always think of, when you overlay pollution and poverty and you see where the deep pockets are, is we really need to be engaging communities in those areas much more. And it's our wish is that there'd be a lot more outreach dollars, education dollars, and at the end of it, I would call it empowerment dollars versus technical assistance, and really empowering the folks in those communities, perhaps starting with youth, to really think about what are their local plans for adaptation and resiliency. You see some of it, and some of it is where there's strong leadership or there's a strong community-based organization, but we need to see a strong network of community leaders that are kind of coming together to forums like this and sharing what it is that they're doing around resiliency or adaptation, sharing best practices, and we're still not there yet. We're getting there little by little, and we think we just need to speed that up a lot faster.
And so I think we have some time for questions from the audience, if anybody has questions before we offer some concluding thoughts. Go ahead. Oh, I think.
Hi, my name is Aya, and I represent 4 grassroots organizations. And you spoke of a network just now, and we're wondering if there's a way for the state to really say, here's a vehicle where the grassroots can organize, because without that kind of leadership from an entity that's outside of the grassroots, it's harder for the grassroots to gather to that one place. There's just, we're all in silos, and I work with an organization called NorCal Resilience, and we're trying to organize, but the hard thing is to really invite all the grassroots organizations that are out there doing the work to come into conversation with each other. And so, do you have any thoughts about how to organize more and network more?
I'll start there. I think this is an issue that it's a little difficult to deal with on a statewide level, and frankly from a government standpoint, and in a government position. But it is something that I see many agencies trying to grapple with. So I think, looking locally, you'll have efforts like, let's take AB 617, which was enacted recently with the renewal of 398 of cap and trade in this past year, and really looking at how the state is trying to work through its role with local air districts, with local governments, thinking about land use and planning decisions and permitting actions and permitting decisions on the local level, and really trying to work with community stakeholders, grassroots community organizations that lack the resources, I think in many respects, to have the same level of leverage as their industry or business counterparts in their communities, and to really be able to advocate for their needs. And so you see these structures like, the AB 617 framework is now proposing these local steering committees, which I think are trying to get at creating a framework of pulling folks together at the grassroots. Similarly, through the Transformative Climate Communities program, there are similar efforts. So through the planning process, there are steering committees that develop. In many ways, those are far less than perfect. In many ways, they are microcosms of the larger structure of our society, and you see the same dynamics playing out, I think, in some of these smaller spaces. But I do think that they provide an opportunity for local stakeholders to engage in conversation around what the issues are that are most pertinent to them, what they want to see changed. It, forces local government representatives and even industry actors to come to the table and really engage and try and troubleshoot and work through some pretty thorny issues. Again, far less than perfect, and I think it is really working out, but an example. And I think the state in many ways has reached challenges in its own role in facilitating those spaces. I think right now the name of the game is sort of like providing the funding and direction to do it, but taking a huge step back and just letting it happen, and not so much being engaged in the day-to-day. I think that makes a lot of sense. I do think that we're moving towards a place where we are providing more direction, particularly when it comes to reductions in emissions, which I think is very important, and kind of the complement that we need to our renewables targets, because we obviously continue to see the disproportionate impact of pollution sources, continuing pollution sources, even though we have these sort of broad and very aggressive renewables targets. So really great question.
Hi.
Go ahead. Oh.
Hi, Mike Antos with the Santa Ana Watershed Project Authority. So I work in sort of a specialized water district now, but I have a past working as a 911 dispatcher, and that becomes relevant here in my question, right? We call up 911 when we need all sorts of different things, and they're a port through which the public reaches the government, and they don't really think through whether they're calling for the right thing. Like, my car is missing, there's a fire, like they call for all sorts of reasons, and the 911 operators answer and try to solve the problem, whatever it happens to be. And even if it is, I'm sorry, that's not a police issue, let me refer you somewhere. So that ethic doesn't exist elsewhere in government, right? We've got lots of specialized government agencies that manage the relationship between the public and climate adaptation, but they're so specialized that they don't know how to hear a request that isn't actually their problem. And they're very often like, sorry, not me, right? And the public reads that and then doesn't even speak up. So earlier you were talking about greenlining as being a technical assistance, right? Providing assistance, that ethic seems to be missing from a lot of our government agencies, that the community can say, I need help, and the agency says, I'll try, and if it's not me, I'll make sure someone else can. Is there any sense that we're heading that direction, that we're trying to inculcate that kind of spirit in the way that government serves the people?
There is an effort. I'm not sure it completely answers that, but there is a bill underway that Greenlining co-sponsored, and I should know the bill number, but it's my staff that worked on it. But what we're trying to do is, one, is create more technical assistance dollars, especially to the smaller cities where they might not have that strong city manager or the staffing to be able to apply for some of these dollars. So that's number one, is really having that TA assistance. But then two, one of the things that we're thinking of a Greenline is like, how do you make it so that there's this one-stop shop, so that if somebody comes in for one program, they might be like, well, you might not apply for this program, but there's these other services here. That's a huge challenge for the issues you stated, right? And other panelists talked about the silos we have. But it's always been a dream that somebody could be like, well, if I'm signing them up for the CARE program, because that's for the energy program, you should also be able to automatically look at what other services you qualify for, right? Whether it's Lifeline, your affordable cell phone service, maybe it's the Earned Income Tax Credit, maybe it's a ride-sharing program. And so that hasn't been invented. I think that's maybe the call we should have, the common call to Silicon Valley is like, this should be this kind of back-end support where somebody comes in for one service and perhaps they get it, and then there's a menu of services. We haven't fully figured that out, but I think there's people that are really thinking about it, and we're always looking for some thought partners on that.
I'll just add that I think the NGOs like Greenlining and others are really emerging as key assets in this area. Again, it's difficult from a governmental standpoint, and I think there are also large statewide organizations, including the California Environmental Justice Alliance as well, who's a really great resource that provide these spaces from the community standpoint to really network, and then also I think are working with many state agencies, more so I'd say on the complaint side of things, so looking at sort of enforcement actions or violations of various environmental standards and rules and regulations, and really trying to assist us in having the right hand talk to the left more, and making sure that we're not leaving complaints that come to any of our agencies just sort of unaddressed and out there floating. I do think it will require a lot of longer term cultural work. I think there are many agencies, particularly in the environmental field, that really don't see themselves as sort of the same as police department. They just don't. They see their role as very different, and I think that'll take quite a bit of time to change, but we're hopefully working towards that. There's another question over here.
Yes, hi, I'm Stephen Mack. I'm an anthropologist, and I run Reap Change Consultants. I'm finally hearing, this is my second or third Adaptation Forum, and I'm finally hearing the discussion about people. I hear the word empowerment. I know that federally recognized tribes have the same governmental status as the United States. They're conquered states, basically. And I'm glad to hear this mentioned, but what I'm worried about a little bit is, as people in this room, the adaptation people, are moving towards looking at regional cooperation, I think tribes maybe have the best handle on this because they've had to do this for years and years and years. But we're talking about intergovernmental cooperations at a regional level, not just the restricted tribal area, not just South El Monte or a portion of Oakland. And yes, we need to pay attention at this local community level, but then how do we also get the regional attention that the climate science tells us that we absolutely need if we're going to adapt and be resilient? Can you comment on that?
Do you want to? If I knew the answer, it would be solved already, so I'll let you take that. Well, I guess from a tribal perspective, I will say that a lot of it is starting to happen with there's a lot of tribes that do local consortia, I guess is the plural, with each other, and really make an effort to work collaboratively with the locals. So there's things like in the roads context, you have San Diego has this thing called SANDAG, and it's all the tribes come together with the Board of Supervisors, and they all talk about these ambitious planning goals for the entire region. And so, you know, you have a lot of turnover, you have a lot of, you know, different components, but at the end of the day, they're still coming together every now and then to make sure that they're all on the same page. And so really from a top-down perspective, from the governor's office, we try not to tell people what to do on a regional level. We think, kind of like was mentioned earlier, is that the locals are in the best place to be able to shape those policies because they're the ones that are experiencing them, and those relationships are really what matter. If I come and I tell all of the locals that they need to listen to tribes, I mean, they're gonna sit down for one meeting, they're gonna listen, and then they're gonna go do whatever they wanted. So it's really about, I think it has to come from the local level where you are making those long-lasting relationships and you are coming to the table with this respectful viewpoint. And so I know that's not, you know, it's hard to affect that change, but it just has to start somewhere. And so if, you know, within Board of Supervisors and within these existing groups, if they can start thinking in a more global way of, you know, yes, we don't have certain jurisdictional authority over these people, but we can come together and we have common interests and we have common constituents that can all benefit from us working together. I think that's a good start.
And I'll just add that I think it increases the leverage obviously so much. So, you know, the Southern California, Northern California for that matter, tribal chairmen's associations, which, you know, if they and Central, if they have, you know, an issue that they're bringing to your attention, I mean, that makes a big difference. That's, you know, sometimes dozens of tribes represented right there. So that certainly does make a big difference. And I will just put another plug for grassroots community-based organizations building the same sort of regional networks and coalitions to really advocate for what is most important for their communities. And so I think you have those in the Central Valley. You have some that are doing a lot of work in the Inland Empire around warehouses. And they're, you know, connected to grassroots organizations in the ports who are addressing the same issues. So really tapping into your non-governmental, you know, community-based organizations in whatever area you're in is so critically important. We'll go, I think we have time for a few more questions, so we can start, I think, here, and then we'll go back. We'll just do back and forth. Go ahead.
Thank you. So I'm the planner for the city of Mount Shasta, and Mount Shasta has a lot of Native American heritage. One of the things we struggle with is getting responses from the Native American tribes in our area. I believe we have like 16 or 17 that are registered for us. And we're in a general plan revision process, and we really want to bring them in for the cultural perspective and the history of the area. What are some recommendations you would have? I know you bring up the word preserve, but we really want to restore some of that culture and bring more people in. So what are some recommendations you have for doing that in a respectful way? And I really like the idea of keeping some of the areas confidential. You bring up crystals and yoga. We have that going on too. So it's a balancing act between all of those different things in Mount Shasta. So I think for me, it's looking for recommendations of how to restore culture respectfully and in a way that's productive for us.
I think from the beginning, I would just say coming to the table without having any sort of framework of what you are trying to accomplish is probably a good approach. There are tribes that don't want restoration. They just want something different. And so I think listening to what the tribes in the area want to do in partnership with you is a good start. But I think also in that area specifically, you have a number of unrecognized tribes. And those tribes, maybe you're less responsive because they have full-time jobs already. And so on top of their jobs, they're trying to operate governments, basically. And so I would recommend in those cases, we have to set up sometimes meetings on Saturdays or after work hours. And so being accommodating of those type of situations and making it as easy as possible for people to engage, whether it's providing them even with their own talking points, I think, so that they can actually start thinking about what some of the options are. Is restoration an option? Is protection an option? What are all of the things that they could be thinking about? What are the laws that they could be looking at? I think, and to be frank, you're fighting against decades of, especially in that area, local conflict with the tribes. And so I think that coming into a room, being open-minded and being willing to take a lot of frustration and anger before you get to something that's actually productive. I think you just have to let the process kind of guide itself. But probably, you're not going to get everybody to agree on something, but making sure that you're being respectful and actually thinking about what those options are that are coming from the tribes and not originating from the local government is probably a good way to go. But I'm happy to talk with you offline about it too if you need some guidance.
I'm sorry, I know I keep adding, but one quick best practice that I think has emerged, at least for me, in some of this work, particularly dealing with tribes, is really, really keeping in mind, I know this is difficult for all of us, keeping in mind your issue is like one of hundreds that they're dealing with, and so that the one effective thing that I've found is really getting on an agenda for a meeting that they already have, that already exists, and figuring out, when that is, and coming in with your, 5-minute spiel on whatever it is that you're kind of giving them notice of or want to discuss with them in that already agendized and already scheduled meeting. I think I've found is the best way to get meaningful input. We'll take 2 more questions, I think. I think we have time for 2 more. Maybe 1. Go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Paloma Pavel, and I'm co-founder with Carl Anthony of Breakthrough Communities in the Bay Area. And we're also a member of several regional coalitions, including the Resilient Communities Initiative and the statewide California Environmental Justice Coalition. And want to thank you for drawing attention to the coalition work that is going on in many of our major regions here in California. So my question today is, as we are working on, and I also want to just say the fact that this is occurring, this session is occurring, is a major evolution in the thinking that's going on in California. And I just want to thank everyone for being here and the organizers for bringing this session forward. So my question is, thank you. This is amazing collaborative work that has really taken years that we are in this room having this conversation. Thank you. So my question is, as we are showing progress in the area of the science, the environmental aspect, and the equity, the community-based aspect, how do we also link those to the economy? So how do we get the envisioning of a future that is both equitable and sound for climate adaptation, linking jobs, job creation to disadvantaged communities. There's a lot of research out there right now that if we continue as we are, 100 million people will be pushed into poverty by 2020 worldwide. So how do we proceed with a kind of community-driven climate adaptation that takes into account the reimagining of an economic system where disadvantaged communities really are thoughtfully driving the economic aspect of this as well? Jobs, job creation, and
Yeah, I think that's really want to appreciate the point. You know, one of the things that we talk about a lot at Greenlining is as we transition into this clean energy economy, which we should, how do we make sure that we don't replicate some of the systems from the past? And we know what those systems are highly segregated workforce, where the folks of color will be at the bottom doing the janitorial work or other low-wage work, and then the C-suite and the board looks very different, right? We can't replicate that system in the clean energy system. And so how do we do that? Big focus is on the jobs, and so one of the things that we've been doing at Greenlining with support of the San Francisco Foundation is to try to map out what are the jobs that are being created with all these dollars coming down specifically into Oakland and Bay Area. Who's tracking the jobs? Who's tracking the quality of jobs? Who are the workforce providers? And lo and behold, we found something that didn't surprise us. One is nobody's tracking the jobs. There's very little coordination. And there really isn't a strong story to be told about what's happening with these dollars. And so that tells us that we're getting the status quo. And the status quo is this economic system that you mentioned that really leaves certain people out. And so I think we need to start the conversation, you know, every conversation around dollars, whether it's bond dollars or infrastructure dollars, needs to start with the jobs piece, right? What are the jobs that are going to be created? What are the qualifications? And then how are we going to create a true pipeline to get folks from workforce programs to these well-paying jobs? And we have to make sure that they're well-paying. We can't just assume that they're going to be well-paying because they're in the clean energy sector. Like, they have to be well-paying. And so that starts just with some intentionality, and it starts with breaking silos, right? It starts with having labor at the table, with nonprofits at the table, with workforce at the table, and those three sectors aren't together thinking about this. Everybody is kind of looking at their own one silo, and so starts with, as we heard earlier, educating our legislators, as our legislators are thinking of these big issues, that they're really starting with a jobs mind frame of, you know, the first question should be like, okay, you want me to do X, Y, Z, what does this mean for jobs, and jobs for who, and how are you going to ensure that those jobs? And if you can think of that equity in the beginning, right, the hard part of all our job is that, you know, there's equity is baked till the end, and then it's way too late. But if you have equity really in the policies, in the legislative language, in the rulemaking, then you're going to have more equitable results. We often find ourselves trying to build equity at the very end, and by then it's too late.
We're going to go for 2 more minutes. Thank you, Orson. We're going to go for 2 more minutes. Very quick question. Shoot.
Actually, I don't have a question. It's more of a comment, so I would be remiss to take this opportunity. So the person who mentioned the opportunity for grassroots organizing, I just wanted to share, so I work for Southern California Edison, and so it was an opportunity for grassroots organizations asking for the convening of like-minded individuals, and our president, R.O. Nichols. So we actually came together and we partnered with the Greenlining Institute. And so I work with Stephanie Chen and Lisa Hu, and we actually once a month we bring together grassroots organizations. So my best practice or suggestion would be is to identify other nonprofit organizations, so maybe larger nonprofit organizations that you can partner with and have the conversation to see how you can convene and maybe bring in others that can help you with solving solutions. So we started as the Environmental Justice Working Group, and now we are more focused on clean energy, so we are the Clean Energy Access Working Group. Edison.com, that's CEAWG. Thank you, Orson.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a great example.
I want to thank both my panelists and Ms. DuPont-Walker for joining us. I'm going to turn over to them for quick closing thoughts, and my only request for the rest of the time that you're here is that you continue to engage in these conversations. We will be around for a bit to answer any remaining questions, but also just please engage in these dialogues as consistently as possible and ask some of the tough questions that you all have already been asking. So go ahead, Christina, do you have any closing thoughts?
I'll just be super quick. I think one of the big opportunities that's associated with speaking at things like this is that I get to indoctrinate all of you in the right way to think about tribes. And so I hope as you go out into the world, you continue to constantly think about how tribes could be engaged in the work that you're doing. So I think everybody here is doing some really amazing and exciting things. And I'm happy to act as a resource and put you in touch with people who can be resources. And I just hope that you all go out into the world and make things better for everybody, but also tribes.
That's great. Appreciate that. Thank you, Christina. I would say so right now, as we're getting ready for an election, there's a challenge out there for all of us to, even if you're registered to vote, that everybody should get somebody else, just at least one person who's not registered, get them to register, get them to vote. And so everyone should do that challenge. And the other challenge is bring somebody to this room next time that's not at this room. Somebody from a community, a high school student, bring somebody here. We got to make sure that it's accessible and the language is accessible and things like that, which I'm sure we will. But bring somebody who's not here that should be here to the table.